Clara Voss was already 12 minutes late when she pushed through the glass doors of Hargreaves and Sutton Legal Partners, her wet coat dripping onto the marble floor of the lobby. The rain had been falling since 5 in the morning, and the underground was packed, and her umbrella had turned inside out twice on the walk from the station. None of that mattered to her supervisor, Geoffrey Crane, who was standing at her desk with a thick bundle of folders in his hands, and the expression of a man who had been waiting far too long. She did not even get a chance to hang up her coat. Geoffrey dropped the bundle on her desk with a sound like a small explosion, and told her, in a flat voice, that the Harcliffe Courier needed to leave by 9:30. It was 9:18. The documents needed to be organized, collated, and placed into the correct sealed envelopes before the courier arrived. And if they missed the window, the Harcliffe estate review would be delayed by a full week, which Geoffrey was apparently not willing to allow. Clara peeled off her wet coat, tossed it over the back of her chair, and sat down. She had been working at Hargreaves and Sutton for 4 years. She had started as a filing clerk, which was not what she had planned for herself when she graduated with a degree in business law from the University of Leeds. But the economy had been difficult, and the job had paid reasonably well, and she had told herself it was temporary. 4 years later, she was a junior legal assistant, which was a small step up from filing clerk but still not what she had planned. She was good at her job, she was fast, careful, and she rarely made mistakes. That morning, she made one. The bundle Geoffrey had left her contained several separate packets of documents, each destined for a different party, in a large estate restructuring involving the Harcliffe holdings. There was a packet for the Harcliffe estate solicitor. There was a packet for the county heritage office. There was a packet for 3 separate trust administrators. And there was a packet for the Duke himself, Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Harcliffe, which contained, among other things, a binding custodial agreement that required a co-signature from an authorized representative of Hargreaves and Sutton. The authorized representative was supposed to be Geoffrey Crane. Geoffrey had apparently signed the authorization card the day before and placed it in a small envelope clipped to the front of the Harcliffe packet. What Clara did not know, and what she had no way of knowing in the rush of that morning, was that the authorization card had slipped from its envelope sometime during the night and had drifted to the bottom of the bundle, where it had mixed in with a collection of loose signature cards that were kept in a small tray on her own desk. Cards that bore her name and her employee number, and that were used for routine document acknowledgments. She picked them up together, without looking closely. The courier window was closing. She collated, she organized, she sealed. She placed the Harcliffe packet in the correct envelope, pressed the seal, and handed the entire bundle to the courier at 9:28. 2 minutes to spare. She made herself a cup of tea, sat back down at her desk, and spent the rest of the morning working through a property lease amendment that Geoffrey had been asking her to finish for 3 days. She did not think about the Harcliffe packet again. She thought about what to have for lunch. She thought about whether she needed to call her landlord about the radiator in her flat, which had been making a sound like a small animal trying to escape from inside the wall. She thought about her friend Donna, who had texted her the night before about a weekend trip to Edinburgh that Clara probably could not afford, but was tempted by anyway. She did not think about the fact that somewhere in the bundle she had just sent, tucked into an official Harcliffe custodial agreement, was a signature card bearing her name instead of Geoffrey Crane's. The Harcliffe estate was one of the oldest continuously held private estates in the southeast of England. It had been in the Ashford family for 11 generations. The estate covered a considerable area of Surrey countryside, including farmland, woodland, a village of tenant cottages, a private chapel, several outbuildings, and the manor house itself, a large, severe Edwardian building that sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with oak trees, so old their roots had begun to lift the stone edging along the path. Edmund Ashford had inherited the title and the estate at the age of 26, when his father died suddenly of a heart condition no one had known existed. He had been in the middle of a postgraduate degree in classical history at Oxford. He did not finish it. Instead, he came home to Harcliffe Manor, met with the estate solicitors, and began the long and complicated process of understanding exactly what he had inherited and what it required of him. What it required was considerable. The Ashford family had, over the course of 11 generations, accumulated not only land and property, but also a remarkable quantity of legal obligations, to tenants, to local heritage bodies, to charitable foundations, and to one another. The estate operated under a founding charter that had been written in the 18th century and amended at irregular intervals since. The charter governed everything from how the estate's income was to be distributed to how decisions about the land were to be made. It was detailed, precise, and in certain sections, deeply unusual by modern standards. One of those unusual sections dealt with what the charter called custodial partnership. The concept was simple in origin, if strange by contemporary norms. In an era when estate management required constant, trusted human presence, the charter had established a provision for the Duke to formally bind a second party to the estate as a co-custodian, someone who would share responsibility for key decisions and carry legal standing within the estate's private registry. The provision had originally been designed for a spouse. Over the generations, it had been used for trusted family members, long-serving estate managers, and in at least one case, a close friend of the Duke, who had served as an informal advisor for 30 years. The provision had not been used in Edmund's lifetime. His father had not used it. His grandfather had not used it. The last time it had been activated was in 1962, when Edmund's great-uncle had formally bound his estate manager under the charter before a long overseas trip. Edmund's solicitor, a careful and methodical man named Harold Finch, had included the custodial agreement in the Harcliffe packet because the estate was in the middle of a significant restructuring, and Harold had advised Edmund that having a formal co-custodian in place, specifically a named representative of the firm handling the restructuring, would streamline the process considerably. The agreement was designed to be temporary, covering the duration of the restructuring period only. Harold Finch received the signed documents from the courier at 11:30 that morning. He opened the Harcliffe packet at his desk, reviewed the contents methodically, and noted that the custodial agreement had been returned with a co-signature. He checked the name on the signature card. He read it twice. The name was not Geoffrey Crane. Harold Finch sat for a moment with the document in his hands. Then he picked up his telephone and called the Hargreaves and Sutton office, where Geoffrey Crane listened to what Harold had to say, went very quiet for several seconds, and then asked Harold to hold while he walked to Clara's desk. Clara was eating her lunch, a sandwich from the place on the corner, when Geoffrey appeared in front of her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not quite anger. It was closer to the look of someone who had just stepped on a nail and was not yet sure how deeply it had gone in. He asked her if she had checked every document in the Harcliffe packet before she sealed it. She said she had. He asked her if she had verified that the authorization card included was the correct one. She put down her sandwich. She looked at him. And then, very slowly, she understood. She went cold all over, in the way that only happens when a mistake becomes real, when it stops being a theory and becomes a fact. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked him, quietly, how bad it was. Geoffrey told her. It was, by any measure, a complicated situation. The signature card bearing Clara's name had been attached to the custodial agreement. The agreement had been submitted to the Harcliffe Estate Registry, the private internal registry that the charter established as the formal record-keeping body for all estate legal instruments. The registry was not a public court. It was not subject to standard civil legal procedures. It operated entirely under the authority of the Ashford Founding Charter, which meant that the documents lodged within it were governed by the charter's own rules. Under those rules, a lodged and countersigned agreement became binding upon receipt and recording. It had already been recorded. Clara's name was now formally listed in the Harcliffe Estate Registry as the co-custodian of the Harcliffe Estate. She stared at Geoffrey for a long time. She was trying to find some part of this that made sense, some angle from which it resolved into something manageable and correctable. She was a practical person. She believed in solutions. She believed that for every problem there was a process, and for every error there was a correction. Geoffrey was not looking at her the way a person looks at someone whose problem is about to be solved. He was looking at her the way a person looks at someone who has just become someone else's problem entirely. He told her that Harold Finch was going to contact the Duke's personal office, and that the estate would need to respond formally before Hargreaves and Sutton could do anything further. He told her to go back to her desk and not to contact anyone at the Harcliffe estate directly. She went back to her desk. She sat down. She looked at her sandwich, which was still sitting on the edge of the desk where she had left it, and she knew she was not going to be able to finish it. Outside the window, the rain was still falling. The street below was gray and wet and full of people moving quickly with their heads down, all of them going somewhere, all of them unbothered by custodial agreements and founding charters and the private registries of 11-generation aristocratic estates. She envied them thoroughly. She picked up her phone and searched the name, Edmund Ashford, Duke of Harcliffe. The results came back immediately. A brief entry on a Heritage Estates website. A mention in a county land registry notice from 2 years ago. A short profile in a publication about English historic properties. There was a single photograph, a formal image taken at some kind of a state event, the manor house visible in the background. The man standing in the foreground was tall, dark-haired, and looking somewhere slightly to the left of the camera, with an expression that gave nothing away at all. She put her phone face down on the desk. She was not going to panic. She was going to wait for the formal response from the estate, and then she was going to find a solution, because there was always a solution, and this was a mistake, and mistakes could be corrected. She repeated this to herself, quietly, until she almost believed it. The formal response from the Harcliffe estate arrived the following morning in the form of a letter delivered by hand. It was written on heavy cream paper with the Ashford crest at the top, a small, intricate design that Clara did not spend much time looking at. She went straight to the body of the letter. It was polite, it was precise, and it was, in every meaningful sense, the opposite of what she had hoped to read. The letter informed her that the Harcliffe Estate Registry had processed and recorded the custodial agreement bearing her signature. It noted that under the terms of the Ashford Founding Charter, a recorded agreement of this type could not be unilaterally voided. It stated that the Duke of Harcliffe had been made aware of the circumstances of the signing, and that his office would be in contact to discuss the practical obligations the agreement carried. The final paragraph informed her that she was now formally listed as co-custodian of the Harcliffe estate, and that the estate expected her to conduct herself accordingly. She read the letter 3 times. Then she walked to Geoffrey's office and knocked on the door. He was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at her. She waited in the doorway. When he hung up, he looked at her with that same careful, controlled expression he had worn the day before, and she knew before he opened his mouth that whatever he was about to say was not going to help. He told her that Hargreaves and Sutton could not represent her in a dispute with the Harcliffe estate, because the firm's contract with the estate created a conflict of interest. He told her she would need to seek independent legal advice. He told her he was sorry for the confusion with the documents. And then he told her that until the situation was resolved, she was suspended from her duties at the firm. She stood in his doorway for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, very clearly and very calmly, that she understood. She went back to her desk. She collected her bag, her coat, still faintly damp from the morning before, and the small plant she kept on the corner of her workspace that had survived 4 years of inconsistent watering and fluorescent lighting. She walked out of Hargreaves and Sutton Legal Partners. She stood on the pavement in the rain and thought about what to do next. The answer, she decided, was to go home, make a proper cup of tea, and begin the process of finding a lawyer who could fix this quickly and cleanly, because it was an error, and errors had remedies, and she was not going to let one rainy Monday morning and one misplaced signature card determine the course of her life. She walked to the station. She was wrong, as it turned out, but she did not know that yet. The first lawyer she called was a man named Philip Okafor, who had been 2 years ahead of her at Leeds and had gone on to set up a small practice in Clerkenwell that handled property and estate disputes. She had not spoken to him in nearly 3 years, but he picked up on the second ring and listened patiently while she explained the situation. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to make her nervous. Philip told her he needed to look at the document before he could say anything definitive. She told him she could be at his office in 40 minutes. He said to come now. She came now. His office was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building above a coffee shop, and it smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, which Clara found oddly comforting. Philip was a compact, precise man who read documents the way other people read arguments, looking for the exact point where things went wrong. He read the letter from the Harcliffe estate 3 times, asked her 2 questions about the timeline, and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He told her that the Ashford Founding Charter was a real legal instrument. He told her that it was one of a small number of private estate charters in England, that had been grandfathered into a heritage legal framework during the 1920s, which gave them a peculiar kind of enforceability that sat outside the normal civil courts but was not without teeth. He told her that breaking the custodial agreement unilaterally, that is, without the Duke's consent, would expose her to a liability claim from the estate that could, depending on how it was pursued, be financially catastrophic. She asked him what her options were. He told her there were essentially two. The first was to approach the Duke directly and request that he consent to a dissolution of the agreement, which would allow both parties to formally exit it through the Charter's own procedures. The second was to contest the original registration on the grounds that the signature was obtained under conditions that invalidated consent, which would require a heritage law specialist and a process that could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years and would cost her considerably. She asked him which one he recommended. He said that if the Duke was a reasonable man, the first option was by far the better one. He said that if the Duke was not a reasonable man, she should call a heritage law specialist and prepare herself for a long process. She thanked him, paid his consultation fee, and went home. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her and tried to think clearly. She was 30 days from the end of her lease. She had savings that would last her approximately 4 months without income. She had no job, a legal situation she did not fully understand, and a binding connection to an estate she had never heard of until 2 days ago. She made a list, because making lists was what she did when things felt out of control. She wrote down every fact she knew. She wrote down every question she needed answered, and at the bottom of the list, in slightly larger letters, she wrote, "Contact the Duke's office directly." She did not do it that night. She did it the next morning, after she had slept and eaten breakfast and changed into clothes that made her feel like a person who had her situation under control, which she did not. But appearances, she had always believed, had a way of becoming reality if you maintained them long enough. She called the number on the Harcliffe estate letterhead. A woman answered. Her voice was smooth and professional and gave nothing away. Clara introduced herself and explained that she wished to request a meeting with the Duke of Harcliffe regarding the custodial agreement recently lodged in the estate registry. The woman asked her to hold. Clara held. There was music, something classical and unhurried, and then the woman came back and said that the Duke's schedule was reviewed every Tuesday morning and that someone from the estate would be in contact with her before the end of the week. Clara said that she would appreciate it if the matter could be treated with some urgency. The woman said she would note that. The call ended. Clara sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it down and went to make another cup of tea, because it was something to do, and doing something, even something small and useless, was better than sitting still. The call came on Thursday afternoon. It was not the woman she had spoken to before. It was a man who introduced himself as Harold Finch, the estate solicitor, whose name she recognized from the original document. His voice was careful and considered, and he apologized, in a formal way, for the complication the document mix-up had caused. He said the Duke was prepared to meet with her the following Saturday at Harcliffe Manor, and that a car would be sent to collect her if she provided her address. She said she would make her own way there. Harold Finch said that was perfectly fine, and gave her the address, which she already had from the letter. He said the meeting was scheduled for 11 in the morning, and that he would be present as well. She said she understood. She spent the next 2 days doing research. She read everything she could find about the Ashford founding charter, which was not much. The charter itself was a private document and not publicly available, but there were references to it in several heritage law articles and in a book about English private estate law that she found through the university library database, which she still had access to through an old alumni account. She read about the concept of custodial partnership. She read about the history of the Harcliffe estate. And she read, more carefully than she had intended to, about Edmund Ashford himself. He was 34 years old. He had inherited the title at 26. He had a degree in classical history from Oxford, which he had not finished, and before that, a boarding school education at a well-regarded school in the north of England. He appeared occasionally in the background of articles about heritage preservation and rural land management, but never at the center of them. He had never been photographed at a social event, never been connected publicly to anyone, never given an interview. The single photograph she found, the same one she had seen on her phone that Monday afternoon, appeared in multiple places, which suggested it was the only one that existed. She found one short paragraph in a Heritage Property magazine from 5 years ago, in which a reporter had visited the Harcliffe estate to write about its restoration program. The reporter had noted that the Duke had declined to be interviewed and had communicated through his estate manager. The estate manager had described the Duke as someone who took the responsibilities of the title seriously and preferred to let the work speak for itself. Clara read that sentence 3 times. She could not decide whether it suggested someone admirable or someone impossible to deal with. She supposed it could be both. On Saturday morning she took the train from Waterloo, and then a taxi from the station. Because the estate was 3 miles from the nearest village, and the idea of walking 3 miles through Surrey countryside in her good shoes was not appealing. The taxi driver did not know where Harcliffe Manor was until she showed him the address on her phone, and then he said, "Ah, the big house," and nodded, as if this explained something. The gravel drive was exactly as long as it looked in photographs. The oak trees were very old and very large, and the rain had stopped for once, so the light came through the leaves in long strips that fell across the gravel in a way that was, she had to admit, rather beautiful. She did not let herself be charmed by this. She was here for one reason. The manor house was built of pale stone that had gone slightly darker with age and weather. It was not decorated in the way that some grand houses tried to impress visitors. There were no elaborate hedges cut into animal shapes, no ostentatious fountains, no attempt to signal wealth through scale alone. The house was large, but it was severe, in a way that felt honest rather than cold. It looked like a place where people actually lived, or at least where someone actually lived, which she supposed was the point. She rang the bell. A middle-aged woman with a calm face answered the door and showed her to a sitting room furnished with good, but not extravagant furniture, and told her that Mr. Finch and His Grace would join her shortly. His Grace. She had not thought about what she would call him. She stood by the window and looked out at a garden that was orderly, without being stiff, and she thought about what she was going to say. She had prepared a clear, measured argument. She was going to be polite. She was going to be professional. She was going to explain the circumstances calmly, acknowledge that the error had caused inconvenience to all parties, and request that the Duke consent to a formal dissolution, so that they could both put this behind them quickly. She heard footsteps in the hall. Harold Finch came in first, a slim man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the kind of calm, unhurried manner that comes from spending decades in rooms where difficult things are discussed. He introduced himself and shook her hand and said he hoped her journey had been straightforward. She said it had. And then Edmund Ashford came into the room. He was taller than the photograph suggested, which photographs often failed to convey. He wore a dark gray sweater and trousers, and no indication whatsoever that he was a person of particular rank or significance. He did not smile when he came in, but he was not unfriendly either. He looked at her with dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive, and he said her name, Clara Voss, the way you say the name of someone whose file you have read and whose situation you have already considered from multiple angles before they walked through the door. She said his name in return. She did not add the title. She was not sure whether that was the right choice, but it was the one she made, and she did not apologize for it. They sat. Harold Finch positioned himself slightly to the side, the way solicitors do when they are present as witnesses, but want to give the impression of not being fully in the room. Clara said she would get directly to the point. Edmund said he would appreciate that. She explained the sequence of events, the rush that morning, the misplaced signature card, the courier deadline, the error she had made without knowing she was making it. She spoke clearly and at a steady pace, because she had practiced this, and she wanted him to understand that she was not here to make excuses, only to establish fact. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said he understood what she was describing. She said she was glad, because she was sure he could see that the situation had arisen through no intention on her part, and that she was requesting his consent to initiate a formal dissolution of the custodial agreement through whatever process the charter specified. He said he heard her. She waited. He said that he understood the agreement had been signed under circumstances that were unintended. He said that was not in dispute. He said that the estate took the recording of the agreement seriously, and that the charter's procedures existed for reasons that went beyond any individual inconvenience. She asked him what that meant in practical terms. He said it meant he was not in a position to consent to a dissolution at this time. The room was quiet. Through the window, a bird was making a persistent sound somewhere in the garden, which suddenly seemed very loud. Clara looked at him. He looked back at her. His expression was not cruel. It was not dismissive. It was not cold, in the way that wealthy, powerful people sometimes go cold when they have decided that a conversation is over. He simply looked like a man who had said the thing he had decided to say, and who was now prepared to deal with the consequences of having said it. She said, "And what does that mean for me?" He said it meant that for the time being, she was the co-custodian of the Harcliffe estate, and that the estate expected her to fulfill the obligations that role carried, which Harold Finch would be happy to outline in detail. She looked at Harold Finch. Harold Finch looked at the table. She looked back at the Duke. She said, with perfect composure, because she was not going to let him see that she was struggling to keep her composure, "I do not accept that." He said he understood that she felt that way. He said she was free to seek legal counsel, and that the estate would cooperate with any inquiry made through the appropriate channels. He said that he hoped, in time, she might come to see the situation differently. She stood up. She thanked him for his time in the precise, clipped tone that means the opposite of gratitude. She walked out of the sitting room, down the hallway, through the front door, and back down the long gravel drive between the old oak trees. She did not let herself look back. She called a taxi from the road and stood in the pale October sunlight and waited, and while she waited she made herself breathe slowly and think clearly, because she was going to need a very good lawyer and a very steady head, and she was going to get both. What she did not think about, what she refused to think about, because it was irrelevant and unhelpful, was the way he had said her name when she walked into the room. The way it came out of his mouth, like a word he had been thinking about for some time. She pushed that thought away entirely. She was very good at pushing thoughts away when she needed to. It was, she had always believed, one of her better qualities. She was not entirely sure, standing there in the Surrey sunlight, that she believed it quite as fully as she used to. She found her heritage law specialist through Philip Okafor, who knew a woman named Harriet Bloom, who had spent 20 years working on cases involving private estate instruments and founding charters. Harriet had short gray hair, and an office full of filing boxes, and a manner so matter-of-fact that Clara felt, for the first time since the whole thing had started, that she might be talking to someone who could actually help her. Harriet read the letter from the estate. She asked for the full name of the charter and the date of its last amendment. She made notes. She asked about the timeline of the signing and the courier submission. She asked whether Clara had spoken directly to the Duke. Clara told her about the meeting at the manor. Harriet's pen stopped moving. She looked up from her notepad and asked Clara exactly what the Duke had said when she requested a dissolution. Clara recounted it word for word. She had a good memory, and she had replayed the conversation enough times in the past 48 hours that she could reproduce it almost precisely. Harriet looked at her for a moment. Then she said something that Clara had not expected. She said, "He knows he can release you." Clara said she assumed so. Harriet said, "No, I mean he knows the procedure." He used the word dissolution. That's the charter's specific terminology. He's read the relevant sections. He knows exactly what releasing you would require. He's choosing not to do it, and he's choosing it deliberately. Clara thought about this. She asked Harriet whether that changed her legal options. Harriet said it was interesting, but no, it did not change the legal position. The charter still gave the Duke the authority to withhold consent for a dissolution during the agreement's active period. The question was whether the original registration could be challenged on the grounds of invalid consent, which was the route Philip had already outlined, and which Harriet confirmed was possible, but lengthy and uncertain in outcome. The second option was to wait the agreement out. Clara asked what that meant. Harriet explained that custodial agreements under the Ashford Charter had a natural expiry point tied to the estate's review cycles. If no action was taken by either party, the agreement would lapse automatically at the conclusion of the estate's current restructuring period. Based on what she knew about typical estate restructuring timelines, Harriet estimated that could be anywhere from 8 months to 14 months from now. Clara said, "So my choices are 1. Legal challenge that takes years and might fail. 2. Wait up to 14 months and hope it expires naturally. Or 3. Get the Duke to agree to release me, which he currently refuses to do. Harriet said that was a fair summary. Clara sat quietly for a moment. She said, "What would make him agree to release me?" Harriet said that was not a legal question. Clara said she knew that. She was asking anyway. Harriet looked at her over her notepad and said that in her experience, people who held formal authority over other people's situations generally released that authority when one of two things happened. Either they ran out of whatever practical use the arrangement provided, or the other person became more trouble than they were worth. Clara thought about that for the taxi ride home. She thought about it for most of that evening, sitting at her kitchen table with the list she had made 3 days ago, which had more items on it now but no fewer unanswered questions. She thought about the way Harriet had said, "He's choosing it deliberately," with the particular weight that comes from saying something that means more than just what the words say. She picked up her phone and looked again at the photograph of Edmund Ashford, the formal image, the manor house behind him, the expression that gave nothing away. What did he want from this? She could not figure it out. She was good at figuring people out. It was a skill she had developed over 4 years of working with lawyers, who were, as a group, people who meant one thing while saying another. But Edmund Ashford was not giving her enough to work with. He had been civil. He had been direct. He had acknowledged the error and declined to correct it, and offered no reason she could use. There was no reason she could use, which meant there was something he was not saying. She wrote that at the bottom of her list. What is he not saying? She underlined it twice. She did not sleep well that night. She dreamed about long corridors in a large stone house, and the sound of someone walking behind her that she could never quite catch up to when she turned around. She woke up before 6 and could not get back to sleep, so she got up, made coffee, and read the Heritage Law article that Harriet had emailed her the previous evening about charter-governed custodial agreements in post-Victorian estate law. It was dense and not particularly easy reading, but she read it carefully, and at the bottom of page 7 she found something that made her stop. There was a footnote. The footnote referenced a specific section of the Ashford Charter, Section 14, subsection 3, which governed the practical obligations of a co-custodian during an active agreement period. The footnote noted that in a 1988 legal review, an academic had observed that the obligations outlined in Section 14 were not merely ceremonial. They required the co-custodian to be actively involved in estate review processes and to have access to estate records. The academic noted that this provision had been designed to ensure that the co-custodian position was substantive rather than symbolic, and that any duke who attempted to hold someone in the co-custodian role without providing them meaningful access to estate affairs would technically be in breach of the charter's own terms. Clara read this 3 times. Then she sent Harriet a message asking whether this was correct. Harriet replied 20 minutes later with a single line, "Yes, that provision stands. He's obligated to include you." Clara put her phone down and sat very still for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She was not helpless here. She was not simply a person waiting for someone else to release her. She had standing. She had rights under the very document that was holding her. And if Edmund Ashford wanted to use the charter to bind her to his estate, then the charter cut both ways. She picked up her phone and called the estate office. The same smooth professional voice answered. Clara asked to be connected to Harold Finch. She was connected. Harold Finch answered with the careful, unhurried tone of a man who was slightly unsurprised to be hearing from her. She told him that she had reviewed the relevant sections of the Ashford Charter and that she was prepared, under the terms of the custodial agreement, to fulfill the obligations of the co-custodian role, as specified in Section 14. She said she expected to be included in the next estate review process and to receive access to the relevant estate records as stipulated. She said she wanted this confirmed in writing by the end of the week. There was a pause. Harold Finch said he would need to discuss this with the Duke. Clara said she was sure he would. She said she would look forward to hearing from him. She ended the call. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed. She had been a junior legal assistant who had made a mistake on a rushed Monday morning. She was not going to remain in this situation passively, waiting for a man she had met once in a sitting room to decide when she was allowed to leave. If he wanted a co-custodian, she was going to be one. And she was going to be one in a way that made it very clear, very quickly, that having her tied to his estate was not going to be the quiet, undemanding arrangement he apparently imagined. The written confirmation arrived the following Thursday. It came in the same heavy cream paper, with the same crest at the top, and it was signed by Harold Finch, on behalf of the Duke of Harcliffe. It confirmed that Clara Voss, in her capacity as co-custodian under the Ashford Charter, was invited to attend the next quarterly estate review, to be held on the last Saturday of October at Harcliffe Manor, commencing at 9 in the morning. She read the letter twice. Then she wrote the date in her calendar, confirmed it with a neatly drawn box around it, and spent the rest of that week researching estate management practices, heritage land law, charitable foundation governance, and the specific financial and legal structure of the Harcliffe holdings. She was not going to walk into that room unprepared. She was not going to sit in a corner and observe politely while Harold Finch and Edmund Ashford spoke over her head about things she did not understand. She was going to know the material. She was going to ask informed questions. She was going to make it very clear that she was there, that she was capable, and that the position she now formally held was not going to be treated as a formality. On the Friday before the review, she received a second letter. This one was brief, just 3 lines. It said that a guest room had been prepared for her at the manor, should she wish to arrive the evening before, and that breakfast would be provided at 8 before the review began. She stared at this letter for a considerably longer time than the previous one. A guest room. He had prepared a guest room. She was not sure whether this was courtesy or strategy. She was not sure whether those two things, in his case, were necessarily different. She wrote back, in a short note, that she would arrive on Friday evening. When the taxi turned down the long gravel drive on a Friday evening in late October, the oak trees were a deep amber, and the last of the afternoon light was sitting low across the fields behind the manor. The house was lit from inside, warm light in the lower windows, a lamp visible through what she assumed was the study. She got out of the taxi and stood for a moment with her overnight bag over one shoulder, looking at the building. She had looked at it in photographs enough times that she felt, strangely, as though she recognized it, as though she had been here before, in some version of this life, that ran slightly alongside the one she was actually living. She went inside. The woman who had answered the door on her first visit showed her to a room on the second floor. A clean, quiet room with a window overlooking the garden, and a fireplace that had been laid ready for lighting, and a small writing desk in the corner, and bookshelves along one wall that contained, she noticed immediately, an interesting and not random collection of books on land management, heritage law, estate history, and something she did not expect, a complete and well-read set of natural history volumes that looked as though they had been pulled from the shelves and put back many times over. She put her bag on the bed. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around it. She thought about who had chosen the books for those shelves. She thought about whether the books had been selected for this room specifically, or whether they had simply always been there. She thought about a great many things she had not intended to think about, and then she told herself firmly to stop thinking and go downstairs to whatever passed for dinner in a house like this. Edmund was in the hallway when she came down. He was carrying what appeared to be a file of documents, and he was moving with the quiet, purposeful pace of someone who had already been working for some time and intended to continue. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her in the same direct, unreadable way he had in the sitting room, and then he said good evening, and asked whether her room was acceptable. She said it was, and that she had noticed the books. He said that they had been in that room for some time. He said it without elaboration, in the way of someone who knows that elaboration is unnecessary and perhaps counterproductive. She said she might borrow one. He said she was welcome to. They stood in the hallway for a moment longer than was required by politeness. Then he said that dinner would be in the small dining room at 7, and that Harold Finch would join them, and that the review materials for the following morning were already on the table in the study, if she wanted to look through them tonight. She said she would like that. He said he would let the housekeeper know, and then he continued down the hallway with his file of documents, and she watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that he was an exceptionally difficult person to read. She went to the study. The review materials were extensive. She sat at the large table in the center of the room and opened the first folder, and for the next 2 hours she read carefully and made notes in the small notebook she had brought with her. And gradually, the shape of what the Harcliffe estate actually was began to come clear to her. It was, she realized, remarkable. Not in the way that old money is often remarkable, not through accumulation or display. It was remarkable because of the degree to which it was managed for purposes beyond itself. The charitable foundation that bore the Ashford name had been funding local schools, environmental projects, and agricultural training programs for 30 years. The tenant farm agreements on the estate were not modern at all. They were long, detailed documents that gave tenants extraordinary security of tenure and tied the estate's income to fair pricing practices that had been written into the charter and never removed. The restoration work on the estate buildings had been done using local tradespeople, sourced from the surrounding villages, at rates that, based on the figures she could see, were above market. This was not, she thought, what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. A portfolio of accumulated wealth, managed for maximum return and minimum disruption, the kind of estate that existed primarily to sustain itself and the family that owned it. This was something else. This was a place that someone had thought hard about. She sat with that thought for a while, and then she turned to the next folder and continued reading. The quarterly review began at 9 on a Saturday morning, in a room that Edmund called the estate room, which was different from the study, and different from the sitting room, and seemed to exist for precisely this kind of meeting. It had a long table with 6 chairs, a wall of cabinets containing organized folders, and 2 tall windows that looked onto the side garden, where the morning frost was still visible on the grass. Harold Finch was already there when Clara arrived, with a cup of coffee and his reading glasses in their proper place, and a neat stack of documents in front of him that mirrored, she noticed, the folders she had spent the previous evening reading. She had made notes, she had questions, she was ready. Edmund arrived 2 minutes later with his own coffee, and no preamble whatsoever. He sat at the head of the table, placed his folder in front of him, and looked at Clara and Harold in turn. He said, "Let us begin." Harold opened with a summary of the estate's financial position for the quarter. He spoke in the measured, precise language of someone who had given this kind of summary many times, and knew exactly which numbers to prioritize. Clara listened and followed along in her own copy and said nothing until Harold reached the section on the tenant farm income projections, at which point she asked a question. She asked why the rental adjustment figure in the 3rd column was listed as provisional. Harold looked at his document. He said it was provisional because the adjustment formula, tied to the agricultural cost index, had not yet been confirmed for the coming year. She asked who confirmed it and on what timeline. Harold said the adjustment was confirmed by the County Agricultural Board, typically in November. She asked whether the provisional figure in the projection was based on the previous year's index or on the forecast. Harold paused. She watched him glance at Edmund, just briefly, and then back at his document. He said it was based on the previous year's index. She said that based on the agricultural cost reports she had looked at the previous evening, the current year's forecast index was running approximately 4% higher than the previous year, which would affect the adjustment figure, and therefore the rental income projection for the next quarter, by a margin that was not insignificant. Harold said he would note that. She said she would appreciate it being reflected in the revised projection. There was a moment of quiet in the room. The frost outside was beginning to melt where the sun touched the grass, and a thin light was coming through the windows that made the room feel cleaner and sharper than it had a few minutes ago. She did not look at Edmund. She had decided she was not going to look at Edmund during the review unless he spoke to her directly, because looking at him made it harder to think clearly, and she needed to think clearly. The review continued. Harold moved through the estate agenda, maintenance schedules, tenant correspondence, the Charitable Foundation's quarterly report, a planning issue with a stretch of boundary wall on the north edge of the property, and a question about the renovation of one of the tenant cottages that had been empty for 6 months. Clara asked questions at relevant points. Some of them were straightforward, seeking information she did not have. Some of them were not straightforward, pushing on assumptions in the documents that she was not sure were correct. On 2 occasions, Harold said he would need to look into the matter further before responding. On one occasion, this was on the question about the boundary wall and whether the planning submission had been filed through the correct heritage body. Edmund answered before Harold could. He answered directly and with complete precision, citing the relevant heritage body, the submission reference, and the expected response timeline. His knowledge of the detail was total, which told her that he carried this information routinely, and not from notes. She met his eyes then, because she could not help it. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who has just revealed something about themselves without intending to. Not secrets, but depth. The look lasted a fraction of a second, and then it was gone, and they were both looking at their documents again. At 12:30, Harold called a break for lunch. The housekeeper, whose name Clara had learned was Margaret, and who appeared to run the manor's domestic affairs with an efficiency that was almost architectural, had prepared a light lunch in the kitchen, which Clara had not expected. She had expected a formal dining room. The kitchen was large and warm and had the lived-in quality of a room that was used daily by real people for real purposes. There were pots of herbs on the windowsill. There was a small dog, an old terrier, asleep on a chair in the corner, who opened one eye when they came in, and then decided not to bother. Edmund bent down and touched the dog's head briefly as he passed. It was the most unguarded thing she had seen him do. She sat at the kitchen table and ate a plate of soup and bread that was better than she expected, and she and Harold talked about the boundary wall issue in more detail, and Edmund mostly listened and occasionally added a precise, clarifying word, and the room was warm, and the dog slept, and Clara had the strange, disorienting sensation of feeling almost comfortable. She did not trust this feeling. She was not here to feel comfortable. She was here to be present, to be active, and to build a record of engagement that would either accelerate the end of this arrangement or, at minimum, ensure that she was not simply a name on a document while things happened around her that she had no part in. That was what she told herself. The afternoon session was more detailed than the morning one. It focused primarily on the charitable foundation, the Ashford Community Trust, which funded a range of projects across the county. Clara had read the Trust's annual report the night before, and she had several observations, the most significant of which was that the Trust's grant allocation process appeared to have no formal review mechanism for assessing outcomes. Money went out, and projects were completed, but there was no documented process for evaluating whether the money had achieved what it was intended to achieve. She raised this during the session. Harold looked at the Trust report. He said that the Trust had operated on a grants basis for 30 years, and that the Foundation Committee reviewed applications carefully. She said she did not doubt the care in the application process. She said she was asking about the output side, whether the Trust tracked what happened after the money was allocated. Harold said he believed the trustees received periodic reports from grantees. She asked whether those reports were standardized in format, or whether they varied by grantee. Harold said he was not certain. She said that without standardization, the reports were difficult to compare, and without comparison, it was hard to demonstrate impact, and without demonstrated impact, the Trust's funding decisions were effectively unjustifiable in any rigorous sense. She said this not to criticize the Trust, but because, if she was going to have any genuine role in the estate, she thought it was worth identifying where systems could be strengthened. The room was quiet when she finished. Harold was looking at his copy of the Trust report with an expression she could not entirely read. Edmund said, "That is a fair observation." She looked at him. He said that the Trust's reporting had evolved organically rather than by design, and that a structured outcome review process was something he had been considering for some time. He said he would ask Harold to put together a proposal for the next quarterly meeting. She said, "Good." She meant it to sound businesslike. She was not entirely sure it came out that way. The review concluded at 4. Harold packed up his folders with methodical efficiency, made several notes in his own small book, and said he would have a revised financial summary to both of them by Wednesday. He said it with the slight emphasis on both of them that people use when they have revised their understanding of a situation partway through a meeting. He left at 4:15. Clara was gathering her own notes at the table when she became aware that Edmund was still in the room, standing at one of the windows and looking out at the garden where the afternoon light was going gray, and the frost was long gone, and a pair of crows were arguing over something near the old stone wall at the far end of the lawn. He said, without turning, "You were thorough." She said she had read the materials the night before. He said he knew that. He said Margaret had mentioned that the light in the study was on until quite late. She said she had wanted to be prepared. He turned then, away from the window. He looked at her in the particular way he had, direct, full attention, nothing withheld from the look but nothing given away by it either. And he said, "You knew more about the tenant income adjustment than Harold did." She said the information was in the agricultural reports. She said she was surprised they were not already cross-referenced in the review documents. He said that Harold had been handling the reviews for 12 years and had developed certain habits. She said that was understandable. She said habits were efficient until they stopped being accurate. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, in the same level voice he used for everything, "I will have the cross-referencing corrected before the next review." She nodded. She picked up her notebook. She was planning to go upstairs and collect her overnight bag and arrange for a taxi back to the station. She had done what she had come to do. She had been present and active, and she had asked the questions she intended to ask, and she had said the things she intended to say. And now she was going to go home and spend the evening thinking about whether any of it had moved her situation forward. She was at the door of the estate room when he said her name. She stopped. He said, "The guest room is available again next month, if you would like to stay the evening before." She turned around. She looked at him across the length of the room. She said she would think about it. He nodded, once, and went back to looking at whatever document was in front of him. She went upstairs, collected her bag, and called a taxi. In the taxi, on the way to the station, she looked out the window at the Surrey countryside, going dark in the early November evening, and she thought about the question she had written at the bottom of her list. What is he not saying? She was beginning to think the answer was not one thing. She was beginning to think the answer was several things, layered over each other like the old stone and the newer stone in the manor's walls. Each layer placed there deliberately, each one serving a purpose, each one connected to the ones below in ways that were not immediately visible from the outside. She was also beginning to think that figuring out those layers was going to take longer than she had planned. She was not sure whether that felt like a problem. She was fairly certain it should. The weeks between the October review and the November one were not quiet. Clara spent them doing two things in parallel, with the kind of structured focus she applied to anything she decided to treat seriously. The first thing was continuing her research into the legal options available to her. She had a second meeting with Harriet Bloom that produced no new avenues but sharpened her understanding of the existing ones. The second thing was building her knowledge of the Harcliffe estate to a level that would have been relevant to an actual professional in estate management. She was not sure when exactly the second thing had stopped being purely tactical. She read about heritage land management. She read about charitable trust governance. She read about the history of agricultural tenancy agreements in England and the ways they had evolved over the past century. She found herself, on a Wednesday evening, spending 2 hours reading about the history of the Ashford family specifically, going back several generations, not because it was legally useful, but because the story was genuinely interesting. 11 generations of people managing the same piece of land through wars and economic collapses, and the disappearance of the social world that had originally given estates like this their meaning. She found an account of the 8th Duke, who had sold off half the estate land in the 1930s to keep the tenant farms going when the income collapsed. She found a record of the 9th Duke, who had converted the chapel for community use and opened the estate grounds to the public on Sundays during the 1950s. She found a mention of Edmund's father, who had died before he could complete a restoration of the estate's secondary buildings, and whose unfinished work Edmund had apparently quietly continued after inheriting the title. She sat with this information and felt something shift, small but real, in the way she understood what she was dealing with. She was not dealing with someone who had trapped her carelessly. She was not dealing with someone who was indifferent to people or to consequences. She was dealing with someone who had very particular ideas about responsibility and obligation, and who appeared to operate by those ideas consistently and without apology. That did not make what he was doing right. She was still bound to an estate she had never signed up for, through an error she had never intended, and he was still refusing to release her, and none of that had changed. But it gave it a different shape. She thought about that for longer than she intended to, and then she went to bed, and in the morning she got up and made her list for the day, and did not write any of it down, because some things, she had found, became more complicated once they were written. The November review was different from the October one, in several ways that Clara noticed before the meeting even began. The first difference was that there was a third folder waiting on the table when she arrived, a new one, not part of the standard review set. Positioned at her place at the table, with a sticky note in handwriting she had not seen before that said simply, "Cross-referenced agricultural data," as requested. She opened it. The agricultural cost index figures had been pulled and integrated into the income projections with a clear, color-coded notation system that made the provisional figures immediately distinguishable from the confirmed ones and showed, at a glance, what the variance range looked like under different index scenarios. It was clean, well-structured, and more useful than anything in the original review pack. She looked at it for a moment. Harold Finch arrived and said good morning and asked if the folder was helpful. She said it was very helpful. Harold said the Duke had asked the estate accountant to prepare it. She said nothing to that. She just put the folder in order with her other materials and waited for the meeting to begin. The second difference was that when Edmund came in, he was carrying 2 cups of coffee rather than 1, and he put one of them in front of her without ceremony, without comment, without any indication that this was anything other than a practical act of ordinary courtesy. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You take it without milk." She had no memory of him observing this at the previous meeting, which meant he had, and had not mentioned it, and had remembered it for a month. She said, "Yes." He said nothing further and opened his folder. The meeting proceeded. This time it covered the charitable trust outcomes question that Clara had raised at the October review. Harold had prepared a short proposal for a standardized reporting framework for grantees, which was competent and thorough, and covered most of what she had suggested. She read through it, asked 2 clarifying questions about the implementation timeline, and suggested one addition, a brief annual survey of grantees that would capture information the formal reports might miss, including any unintended outcomes, positive or negative, that the projects had produced. Edmund said that was a good addition. Harold made a note. She did not feel the small internal satisfaction she expected to feel. She felt something less tidy than satisfaction, something that did not have an easy label, and she was not going to examine it during a meeting. They moved through the rest of the agenda. At the end of the session, Harold mentioned that the estate had received a letter from a heritage conservation body requesting a site visit to assess the condition of the secondary buildings at the north end of the estate grounds, in connection with a possible listing application. He said this was a significant development and that it would likely require considerable documentation and coordination over the coming months. Clara asked whether the estate had an inventory of the building's current condition. Harold said there was a survey from 4 years ago. She said that a 4-year-old survey was probably not going to satisfy a heritage body conducting a listing assessment. She said they would need current documentation, photographs, condition reports, structural assessments for the key structures at minimum. Harold said he would arrange that. Edmund said that he had been through the buildings recently and could provide detailed written notes as a starting point. Clara said that would be useful. She looked at him when she said it, and he was already looking at her, and neither of them looked away for longer than was entirely professional. After the meeting broke up for lunch, Clara did something she had not done at the October review. Instead of going directly to the kitchen, she asked Edmund whether she could see the secondary buildings he had mentioned. She said it would help her understand the documentation that would be needed for the heritage assessment. He said he would take her after lunch. They walked out to the north end of the estate grounds in the early afternoon, with the gray November sky pressing low overhead, and the grass wet underfoot, and their breath visible in the cold air. The secondary buildings were a cluster of old structures set against the stone boundary wall, a long barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, a carriage house with half its roof tiles replaced in a slightly different shade of stone, and at the far end, a small cottage that looked as though it had been standing since before anyone had thought about calling anything a heritage site. Edmund walked her through each building with the same level, unhurried manner he brought to everything. But here, something was different. Here he spoke, with a specificity and an ease that she had not heard from him at the meeting table. He talked about the construction methods used in the original barn, the technique of the stone laying, the way the timber had been selected for the roof beams, the reason the northern wall was slightly thicker than the others. He talked about what each building had been used for, and how its purpose had changed over the generations. He talked about the repair work that had already been done, and the work that still needed to happen, and what, in his view, the heritage body would be most interested in assessing. She listened. She asked questions, but not the tactical kind she asked at the meeting table. She asked the kind of questions that arise when you are genuinely interested in what someone is telling you, and want to understand it more fully. He answered them with the same completeness he brought to everything. At the small cottage at the far end, he stopped and looked at it for a moment before speaking. He said his father had been in the middle of restoring this one when he died. He said the roof had been repaired, and the interior walls had been properly relined in the years since. But the external stonework on the south face needed pointing, and there were 2 window frames that would have to be replaced before the winter got too far along. He said this not with sentiment, but with the plain, practical tone of someone reporting a fact about a thing they are responsible for. She looked at the south face of the cottage. Then she looked at him. She said, "You finished everything he started." He said he had tried to. She said, "That's not a small thing." He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It is the least the estate owes him." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The drive back to the station that evening was in Edmund's car, because Harold Finch had offered her a lift to the village, and Edmund had said, without apparent deliberation, that he was going into town that evening, and would take her to the station directly. Harold had looked at Clara, and Clara had looked at Edmund, and said that was very kind of him. It was a 20-minute drive. For the first 10 minutes they talked about the heritage assessment documentation, and she made notes on her phone, and he answered her questions with the same precision he always used. Then there was a gap in the conversation, and neither of them filled it immediately, and the silence that opened up between them was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that has enough room in it for both people. She said, looking out the window at the dark hedgerows going past, "Why classical history?" He said, "Pardon?" She said, "At Oxford. Your degree. Why classical history?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had been interested, since he was a child, in how civilizations decided what to keep and what to let go. He said that in classical history, the answers were unusually clear, because you could look at the outcome, you could see what was lost and what survived, and make some judgment about which decisions had proved wise. He said that when you were managing something old and ongoing and full of obligations, as he had been doing for 8 years, the perspective was useful. She said, "You applied the degree even though you didn't finish it." He said, "Perhaps that is the only honest use of an unfinished degree." She turned to look at him then. He was watching the road, both hands easy on the wheel, and there was the faintest change in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the echo of one, as if the idea of the smile had passed through without fully arriving. She turned back to the window. She thought, this is the problem. The problem was not the contract. The contract was a practical difficulty with a legal framework and a set of possible solutions, and she was working on it, and eventually, one of those solutions would resolve it. The problem was that she was finding it harder, with each passing week, to be purely tactical about any of this. She was finding it harder to sit in the estate room and ask sharp questions purely in service of her legal position, because the questions had become genuinely interesting. She was finding it harder to regard the walk through the outbuildings as research, because she had been engaged by every word of it. She was finding it harder to sit in a car in the dark and feel nothing when the person driving said something unexpectedly honest. She was disciplined about many things. She had been disciplined about her career and her finances and her relationships and her plans. Discipline was one of the things she was most reliably good at. She was not sure it was going to be enough for this. At the station, he stopped the car, and she got out and said thank you, and he said the drive was no trouble, and she stood on the pavement, and he looked at her through the open window, with the same direct, unrevealing look he had had since the first day in the sitting room, except that it was not entirely the same, because she knew more now about what was behind it, and knowing more about what was behind it made it considerably harder to look at without feeling something she was not yet ready to name. She said goodnight. He said goodnight, Clara. She went into the station. She was on the train before she let herself think about it, and even then, she only thought about it for a moment before pulling out her notebook and opening it to a new page and writing, in small, precise letters, "Do not lose clarity." She underlined it. She stared at it for the rest of the journey. It stared back. December came, and with it the estate's annual accounts review, which was a longer and more complex meeting than the quarterly reviews, and which Clara had been sent the preparatory materials for 2 weeks in advance. She spent those 2 weeks going through the materials with the same focused attention she had brought to everything connected with the estate, and she arrived at Harcliffe Manor on a Friday evening in early December to find that the room she had come to think of, quietly and without acknowledging it, as her room, was ready with the fire laid and the lamp on, and the natural history books still on the shelves. She had borrowed one of the natural history books at the end of October. She had returned it in November, with a sticky note inside the front cover marking a passage she had found interesting. She did not know whether he had read the note. The book was back on the shelf, in the correct position, which she chose not to read anything into. She put her bag on the bed and sat on the edge of it for a moment, and looked out the window at the dark garden below, and thought, with the steady, honest part of herself that she tried to listen to more than she sometimes did, that she needed to be very careful. Not because anything had happened, because nothing had happened, and yet she was here, in this room, in this house, in this situation she had not chosen, and she was not unhappy, and that was the thing she needed to be most careful about. Because unhappiness, she had always found, was simple. Unhappiness was clear. You knew where you stood with unhappiness, and you knew what direction to move in to get away from it. What she was feeling was not simple. It was not clear, and she did not know, if she moved toward it, what she would find at the other end. She got up, straightened her jacket, and went downstairs to look at the annual accounts. The annual accounts review ran over 2 days. It was the most comprehensive meeting Clara had sat through since arriving at the estate, covering not only the financial position of the Harcliffe holdings, but also the structural health of the various legal instruments that underpinned it: the trust, the tenant agreements, the heritage designations, the charitable foundation's governance documents. Harold Finch had prepared an extraordinary amount of material. Clara had read all of it. On the morning of the second day, working through the section on the trust's investment portfolio, she found something that stopped her mid-sentence. She asked Harold to confirm the date on the portfolio summary he had handed her. Harold said it was dated the 1st of September. She said, then it's 4 months out of date. Harold said that the trust portfolio was reviewed annually and that the September summary was the current review document. She said she understood that. She said she was looking at the portfolio allocation and asking whether the trust had been advised about the performance shift in the fixed income instruments that had occurred between September and now. She said she had been following the relevant market data as part of her own financial planning, and the shift was material enough that a portfolio of this size would have been affected. Harold said he would need to check with the trust's investment advisors. She said she would appreciate it if he could do that before the next meeting, because if the portfolio allocation needed to be discussed, it was better to have that conversation with accurate numbers. There was the usual pause, the usual quick glance between Harold and Edmund, which she had stopped pretending she did not notice. The usual written note in Harold's book. Edmund said, "Where did you find the market data?" She told him. It was a weekly economic briefing she had subscribed to since she was a student, because she had always been more interested in the economy than her degree strictly required. He said nothing to that, just made a note of the source on his own copy of the agenda. That afternoon, in the gap between sessions, she found herself alone in the estate room for the first time. Harold had stepped out to make a call. Edmund had gone to speak to Margaret about something in the kitchen. The room was quiet, and the winter light was low through the windows, and Clara sat at the table with her notes and felt, suddenly and without much warning, the weight of the past 3 months settle on her all at once. She was here. She was genuinely here, in a way she had not intended, and had spent a great deal of energy resisting, and the resistance had not stopped it from happening. She had arrived at this estate 3 months ago as a problem to be solved, and had gradually, without quite realizing when the shift happened, become something else. She had become a participant. She had become someone who had opinions about trust governance and agricultural income indices, and the condition of the stonework on a 19th-century carriage house. She had become someone who had a room in this house that she thought of as hers. She had become someone who noticed, every single time, when a particular person came into the room. She put her pen down. She stared at the table. The door opened, and Edmund came back in. He looked at her, and then at the pen on the table, and said nothing. He sat down at his own chair, opened his folder, and began reading where he had left off. She picked up her pen. They sat in silence, both working, and the room was warm, and the winter light moved slowly across the floor, and she thought, "This is the thing I have been trying not to think about." That evening, After Harold had left and Margaret had cleared the dinner things and the manor was quiet, Clara went to the study to return the book she had borrowed in November. She had read it twice, the second time slowly, in the evenings at her flat, when she was supposed to be doing other things. She put it back on the shelf in the study, and was turning to leave, when she noticed, on the desk in the corner, a stack of books that had clearly been pulled from different shelves, and were waiting to be reshelved. On top of the stack was a volume she recognized, one of the natural history books from the shelf in her room, open to the page she had marked with her sticky note. She stood looking at it for a moment. The note was still there. He had not removed it. He had moved the book to his desk, apparently, and left the note in place. She picked up the book and looked at the passage she had marked. It was a description of the way old-growth woodland adapts to changes in climate over long periods of time. Not dramatically, not through visible transformation, but through a slow internal process of strengthening the things that are already there, while quietly releasing the things that have become unnecessary. She had not thought particularly hard about why she had marked it. She had just found it striking. She put the book back on the stack. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time. The next morning she made a decision. It was a practical one, and she packaged it that way in her mind, because practical decisions were the kind she was best at making, and she needed to be clear-headed. The decision was that she was going to use the estate access that the charter entitled her to, in order to look at the historical charter documents directly. Not the current edition summary she had been working from, but the original charter and its full amendment history. She wanted to understand, in complete detail, exactly what the custodial agreement said, and exactly what it meant, and exactly when and how it could end. She requested access through Harold after breakfast. Harold said he would arrange it. Edmund was in the room when she made the request and said nothing, which she had learned to read as neither approval nor disapproval, but simply the absence of objection. The historical charter documents were housed in a room off the study that served as a private archive. Clara spent most of the final morning of her December visit in this room, reading through documents that ranged from a faded original charter, written in formal 18th century language, to a series of increasingly clear and modern amendments that brought it closer to something she could read without translating. She found the custodial agreement provision in section 14, as she had known she would. She read it in full, including all the subsections, all the historical footnotes, all the amendments that had been added and removed over the years, and she found, buried in a subsection that had been added in the 1947 amendment and not subsequently touched, a clause she had not known existed. The clause said that a custodial agreement could be dissolved at any time with the consent of both parties. That she knew. But it also said something else. It said that if the co-custodian fulfilled the obligations of the role in good faith for a continuous period of not less than 6 months from the date of registration, the agreement became permanent unless dissolved by mutual consent. She read this sentence 3 times. Permanent, unless dissolved by mutual consent. She had been co-custodian since the first Monday of October. 6 months from that date was the first Monday of April. She had 2 months and 3 weeks before the agreement stopped being something imposed on her and became something she had, through participation, accepted. She walked out of the archive room. She walked down the hall to the estate room, where Edmund was sitting at the table with his own documents, and she put the original charter text in front of him, open to the 1947 amendment, and she said, "You knew about this clause." He looked at the document. Then he looked at her. He said, "Yes." She said, "And you did not think it was relevant to tell me about it." He said he had expected his solicitor to explain the full terms of the agreement to her. She said, "Harold Finch told me nothing about this clause." He said, "I know. I became aware of that later." She stood across the table from him. She was trying to keep her voice level, not because she did not feel what she felt, but because she was not going to have this conversation at the pitch of her emotion. She was going to have it clearly. She said, "So I have been participating in this estate for 3 months, without knowing that participation was making the agreement permanent." He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you intend for me not to know that?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "I intended to have this conversation with you. I have not done so yet, and I take responsibility for that." She said, "Why have you not done so?" He was quiet for a moment, that was longer than his usual pauses. Then he said, that he had not found the right way to begin it, and that was not an excuse, but a fact, and he was telling her now. She said, "When were you going to tell me?" He said, "Before April." The room was quiet. Outside, the December garden was bare and cold and entirely still. She said, "That is not a satisfactory answer." He said, "No, it is not." She looked at him. He did not look away, which she had found he never did, and his expression was the same as it always was, direct and unreadable, except that it was not entirely the same, because beneath the directness there was something she had not seen before. It looked very much like the face of someone who knows they owe an explanation, and has not yet worked out how to give one, without giving away more than they intended. She picked up the charter document. She said, "I need to think about this." He said, "I understand." She went upstairs. She stood at the window of her room and looked at the bare December garden and the gray sky above it, and the old stone wall at the far end of the lawn, and thought about what she had just learned, and what it meant, and what she was going to do with it. 3 months ago, she had arrived at this estate as someone who had made an accidental error and wanted to correct it. She had arrived with a list of facts and a set of legal options, and the intention to be present and active, and difficult enough that the arrangement would resolve itself quickly. She had been present and active. She had not been difficult enough, apparently, or at least not in the way she had intended, because 3 months of presence and activity had not resolved the situation. They had deepened it. She had 2 months and 3 weeks before it deepened further, past the point where it could be undone unilaterally. What she needed to decide was whether she wanted it undone. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put the charter document beside her. She thought about the walk through the outbuildings in November. She thought about the drive to the station and classical history, and the shape of a smile that did not fully arrive. She thought about a book on a desk with a sticky note still in it. She thought about what it meant to build something. She had spent 4 years at Hargreaves and Sutton, becoming gradually more capable at a job that was gradually becoming clearer, was not going to lead anywhere she wanted to go. She had told herself it was temporary, and let temporary become permanent, because she did not have enough reason to change course. She had not built anything during those 4 years. She had maintained. She had managed. She had been competent. The Harcliffe estate was being built. Slowly, over generations, imperfectly, with gaps and failures, and unfinished restoration work, and unresolved charter clauses, and a duke who was better at doing things than explaining them. But it was being built, towards something, with intention. She had spent 3 months being part of that. She was not ready to decide what that meant yet, but she was beginning to think that the question was not quite the one she had originally believed herself to be asking. She went back downstairs. Edmund was still in the estate room. He looked up when she came in. She said, "I want to see the full amendment history of Section 14. Every change, every date, every reason given. And I want to understand why the 1947 clause was added, and what circumstances led to it." He said, "I will have Harold compile it." She said, "I would rather you told me yourself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He closed his folder. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He began to talk. The story of the 1947 amendment was not what she had expected. Edmund told it without drama, in the same level, unhurried voice he used for everything. But as he spoke, she understood that what he was telling her was not dry legal history. It was a story about a person. His great-great-uncle, the 9th Duke of Harcliffe, had been a man named Edward Ashford, not Edmund, which was a name the family had returned to a generation later, but Edward, which was apparently how the name had started before it changed. Edward Ashford had inherited the estate in 1930, in the middle of conditions that would have been catastrophic for most people in his position. He had sold land. He had reduced his own household to a fraction of its former size. He had kept the tenant farms running when their income barely covered the maintenance costs, because the families on those farms had been there for 2 and 3 generations, and he did not see how he could in good conscience do otherwise. In 1943, he had brought in an estate manager named Frank Holt, who was not from the aristocratic world at all. He was a farmer's son from the neighboring county, who had a remarkable head for land management, and whom Edward had met during a county agricultural committee meeting. Edward had trusted Frank completely, and had wanted that trust to have legal weight. He had wanted Frank's decisions to carry the same authority as his own, not because he could not make decisions alone, but because he believed that the estate was better managed by two people who thought clearly and knew it well than by one person who owned it. The 1947 amendment had been written specifically to formalize that relationship. The permanent, after 6 months clause had been Frank's own suggestion. He had said, and Edmund quoted this from memory, which told Clara that he had read this document many times, that a temporary thing was always partly elsewhere, always partly not committed. He had said that if the estate was worth managing, it was worth committing to, and that he did not want to manage it on a renewable basis like a hired hand. He had said he wanted to either be part of it or not, and he wanted to know which one it was. Edward had agreed. Frank Holt had co-managed the Harcliffe estate for 27 years, until his death in 1974. He had never personally owned any part of it. The commitment was not financial. It was something else entirely. Edmund finished the story. The room was quiet. Clara said, "Your great-great-uncle amended the charter for a man who was a farmer's son." Edmund said, "The charter was written to serve the estate, not the other way around." She thought about that. She said, "And you used a clause that was written for a person who wanted to commit to the estate on a person who came here by accident and had no intention of committing to anything." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said nothing for a moment. Then he said that he had read her professional record before their first meeting, as he had told her. He said that the record showed a person who was considerably more capable than her position at the firm had reflected, and that this had made him curious. He said that he had also, in the course of reviewing the document situation with Harold, thought carefully about what the charter required, and what the estate needed, and whether the two things might be, in this case, the same. She said, "You saw an opportunity." He said, "I saw a possibility." She said, "Those are not the same thing." He said, "No, they are not. One is something you take from a situation. The other is something you try to make happen." She held that distinction in her mind and turned it over. She said, "What were you trying to make happen?" He said, "I was trying to find out whether a person who came here under difficult circumstances, and who had every reason to be present only as a formality, might find that the estate was worth being genuinely present for." She said, "You were testing me." He said, "I was observing. I was not setting a standard for you to pass or fail. I was waiting to see whether the situation would produce something real." She said, "And if it hadn't?" He said, "I would have dissolved the agreement before April. I would have had Harold explain the permanent clause to you at the beginning, and I would have released you when you asked me to, as I should have done from the start." She looked at him. She said, "So the only reason you were holding on to the agreement was to see whether I would want to stay?" He said, "That is a fair summary, yes." She said, "And what if I had known from the start that my participation was being observed to see whether I would want to stay? What if you had simply told me, at the first meeting, what the situation was, and what you were hoping for?" He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I did not think you would stay, if you knew." She said, "That is the first honest thing you have said to me that actually sounds like honesty, rather than precision." He looked at her. She said, "Precision is not the same as openness. You are precise with me. You are direct. But you have been managing the information between us very carefully." He said, "Yes, that is true." She said, "It is also what you have been criticizing me for not doing, staying present rather than managing my position, and you have been doing exactly that yourself." He said, "Also true." The room was quiet again. The December evening had come down outside the windows, and the garden was invisible now, just dark glass. She said, "I am going to think about all of this." He said, "Take whatever time you need." She said, "I do not need you to give me permission to take time." He said, "No, I know that." She gathered her things. She did not leave immediately. She stayed at the table for another few minutes, going through the charter document one more time, making notes, giving herself the cover of a practical task, while she brought her thoughts under control. He went back to his own work across the table and did not say anything further. It was, she thought, a remarkable quality he had, the ability to be present without pressing. Most people who wanted something from another person pressed, in some way, even when they were trying not to. He did not press. He occupied his own space, and left the space around him open, and she did not know whether that was natural to him, or whether it was something he had developed on purpose. She supposed it did not matter which one it was. She left that evening. She took the train home, and sat with her forehead against the cold glass of the window, and watched the dark countryside pass. She was angry. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She was angry that she had been in a situation without full information, that the shape of it had been managed without her knowledge, that she had been observed and assessed while she thought she was simply doing a job. She was also, underneath the anger, doing something she had not done in a long time. She was thinking about what she wanted, not what was correct, not what was prudent, not what fit the plan she had made for herself, the orderly structure of steps and goals that she kept in a notebook and reviewed every January and updated every 6 months. What she actually wanted, right now, underneath the anger and the legal situation, and the 4 months of complicated feelings she had been organizing into folders marked irrelevant and set aside. She was not going to answer that question on the train. She was going to go home and sleep and make a proper list in the morning and work through it logically. She went home. She did not sleep well. She did not make the list in the morning. She called her sister instead. Her sister's name was Nell, short for Eleanor, and she was 3 years older than Clara, and worked as a GP in Bristol, and had a husband and 2 children, and a house that was permanently slightly messy in the warm, inhabited way that Clara's flat was not. Nell was the person Clara called when she needed to think out loud and could not do it alone, which was rare, but when it happened, was usually significant. Clara told Nell everything. The contract, the meetings, the charter, the outbuildings, the coffee without milk, the book with the sticky note still in it, the 1947 amendment, and Frank Holt, and what Edmund had said, and what she had said back. Nell listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. When Clara finished, Nell said, "You like him?" Clara said that was not the relevant question. Nell said, "Clara, it is the only relevant question." Clara said it was complicated. Nell said, "It sounds very straightforward to me. You signed a form by accident and ended up somewhere you did not intend, and you have been finding out, for the past 3 months, that you want to be there. That is not complicated. You are making it complicated because you are afraid." Clara said she was not afraid. Nell said nothing. Clara said, "I am cautious." Nell said that was the same thing in different clothes. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He withheld information from me. He managed the situation without telling me the full terms of what I was in." Nell said, "Yes, and he has acknowledged that, and taken responsibility for it, and given you the full picture now. What do you want to do with it?" Clara did not answer immediately. Nell said, "Here is what I know about you. I know that you have spent most of the last 4 years in a job you outgrew 2 years ago, because changing it felt too uncertain. I know that you plan everything and then wait to feel ready, and feeling ready is something you are extremely patient about. I know that the last time you really wanted something that was not in your plan, you talked yourself out of it so thoroughly that you do not even remember talking yourself out of it. I know all of this because I have been watching it since you were 25 years old." Clara said, "This is not the same thing." Nell said, "What is different about it?" Clara opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Nell said, more gently, "What would you tell someone else to do? If someone came to you with this story, all of it, what would you tell them?" Clara thought about that. She said, after a long pause, "I would tell them to stop treating clarity as something that comes before the decision, and start treating it as something that comes from making one." Nell said, "Then there you go." Clara sat with the phone against her ear, and looked at the kitchen table and the cold cup of tea beside her notebook and the list she had not made. She said, "It is still complicated." Nell said, "Everything worth having is complicated. That is how you know it matters." Clara said she would think about it. Nell said she knew. They said goodbye. Clara sat for a long time at the kitchen table. She did not make the list. She did not write anything. She sat with the quiet in the flat that she had always found comfortable, and noticed that it felt, this morning, rather different than it usually did, less like peace and more like absence. She thought about a barn with old timber roof beams, and a specific technique of stone laying, and a man who talked about it the way other people talked about things they loved. She thought about 2 months and 3 weeks. She thought about Frank Holt, a farmer's son from the neighboring county, who had said, "A temporary thing is always partly elsewhere, always partly not committed." She got up from the table. She did not make a list. She went to her bookshelf instead, a modest collection, organized by subject, as everything in her flat was organized. She found the natural history book she had borrowed from the study at Harcliffe Manor. She had bought her own copy, after returning the borrowed one, because she had wanted to read it, without the time pressure of having to give it back. She opened it to the passage she had marked. She read it again. Old-growth woodland adapts to changes in its environment, not through dramatic transformation, but through a slow internal process of strengthening what is already there, while quietly releasing what has become unnecessary. She stood in the middle of her flat and held the book and thought about what it meant to let go of the version of a plan that had stopped fitting, and whether that was loss or the beginning of something else. It was both, she decided. It was almost always both. The letter from the heritage law professor arrived in the second week of January. Clara had been back in contact with Harriet Bloom before Christmas. Not to pursue the legal challenge. She had set that aside, tentatively, while she thought, but to maintain the information channel and keep her options current. Harriet had mentioned in passing that she was going to present a paper at a conference in early January on private estate charter law, and that she intended to include a brief discussion of the Ashford Charter as an anonymized case study. It was apparently through the conference that Professor Alan Croft, a retired academic who had spent his career in heritage law at the University of Exeter, had become aware of the custodial agreement situation. Harriet had forwarded his details and a brief summary of what he had told her. His finding was this: there was a 1987 amendment to the Ashford Charter, the most recent amendment, added under Edmund's father, that contained a provision Harriet had not found, and that significantly changed the picture around the permanent clause. The 1987 amendment stated that the 6-month permanence provision in the 1947 edition applied only if the primary estate holder had, at the time of the agreement's initiation, provided the co-custodian with full disclosure of all charter terms relevant to their role. If full disclosure had not been provided, the permanence clause was suspended indefinitely, and the agreement could be dissolved by the co-custodian's unilateral request at any point. Clara read this 3 times. Then she called Harriet. Harriet confirmed it. She said she had pulled the 1987 amendment text as soon as the professor had flagged it, and it was unambiguous, because Edmund had not fully disclosed the terms of the agreement to Clara at the outset, specifically because he had not told her about the permanence clause. The 6-month clock was not running. The permanence provision was suspended. She could, at any point, request a formal dissolution, and the estate would be legally obligated to process it. Clara sat at her kitchen table with the phone in her hand after the call ended. She was entirely still for about 2 minutes. Then she picked up her coat and her notebook and went for a walk, because she needed to think, and she could not do it sitting down. The January street outside her flat was cold and clear. People were moving past with shopping bags and pushchairs, and the determined pace of people who had places to be. She walked without direction for a while, turning corners and crossing roads without paying particular attention to where she was going. She could leave. That was the thing. She could leave right now. She could contact Harold Finch today, cite the 1987 amendment, and request a formal dissolution. The estate would have to comply. The agreement would end. She would be free of it entirely. Free of the quarterly reviews, and the estate rooms, and the guest room, and the outbuildings, and the coffee without milk, and the book on the desk. She could leave. The question was whether she wanted to. She had asked herself this question before, at the end of October, and throughout November, and in the weeks since the December visit. She had asked it in forms she could manage: logical, conditional, provisional. She had not asked it cleanly. She had not asked it as the thing it actually was. Do you want to leave? She stopped at the edge of a small square near the river, where there was a bench and a tree and a view of the water going past in its winter gray. She sat on the bench. She thought about what she had been doing for the past 3 months. Not just the estate meetings, not just the practical engagement with the trust and the accounts and the outbuildings. She thought about who she had been during those months, sharper, more focused, more genuinely engaged than she had been at Hargreaves and Sutton in 2 years at least. She thought about asking questions that interested her, rather than questions that were tactically useful. She thought about the difference between maintaining something and building something. She thought about the man who had put a cross-referenced agricultural data folder at her place at the table and said nothing about it. She thought about the man who had said, "I did not think you would stay if you knew." That sentence had been turning in her head since December. She had been angry about it. She was still somewhat angry about it. He had made a decision for her, based on what he predicted she would choose, rather than giving her the information she needed to choose for herself. That was wrong. She had told him so, and he had acknowledged it without excuse. But underneath the wrong of it was something else, something she had been sitting next to for weeks, without looking at it directly. He had wanted her to stay. Not because of what the charter required. Not because of what the estate needed. He had wanted her specifically, a person he had looked at on paper, and then in a room, and then over the course of 3 months of meetings and drives and walks and silences, and a conversation that ran from evening to well past midnight, without either of them noticing how late it had got. He had wanted her to stay, and he had not known how to ask her, so he had done the thing he had a charter provision for, which was to create the conditions in which she could decide for herself. That was not a good justification. She was not trying to make it one. But it was, she thought, sitting on the bench by the gray winter river, a human thing, a recognizably human thing, done by a person who was private and careful and not good at asking for what he wanted, and who had, in his own managed way, been trying. She sat for a long time. A woman walked past with a dog on a long lead who paused at the bench and put its front paws up on the seat to look at Clara, and Clara scratched its ears without thinking, and the dog dropped back down and went on. She thought about Nell's question. What would you tell someone else to do? She thought about her own answer. Stop treating clarity as something that comes before the decision. She had been waiting to be certain before she made any choice. She had been waiting for the feeling to resolve into something she could label and categorize and put in the correct place in her notebook. She had been treating certainty as a prerequisite, which meant she had been treating the absence of certainty as a reason to stay still. The absence of certainty was not a reason to stay still. The presence of something real was a reason to move. She got up from the bench. She did not call Harold Finch. She went home and made herself a proper lunch and spent the afternoon doing something she had been putting off for 3 weeks, which was writing a proposal for the Charitable Trust's Outcome Review Framework. She had mentioned the idea at the October meeting, and it had been adopted in principle, but no one had yet drafted the actual framework. She spent 3 hours on it, pulling together everything she knew about impact assessment from her reading, and her background, and the specific context of the Harcliffe Trust's existing structure, and by the time she finished it was something she was genuinely proud of. She emailed it to Harold with a short note saying she had taken the liberty of drafting a full framework proposal for discussion at the next quarterly review. Harold replied within the hour. He said, "This is excellent work. I will circulate it to the Duke for his review." She said, "Thank you. I hope it is useful." She closed her laptop. She looked at her notebook on the table, the list with "What is he not saying?" written at the bottom and underlined twice. She turned to a new page. She wrote, "What do I actually want?" She wrote it without underlining it, without putting it in a box, without any of the structural devices she usually used to give her notes weight. She just wrote it and looked at it. Then, below it, she wrote 3 things. They were not points in an argument. They were not components of a decision matrix. They were just 3 true things. The first was, "I am better at this than anything I have done in 4 years." The second was, "I want to see what the estate becomes." The third was, "I want to have that conversation again, the one in the estate room in December, without the anger in the way." She looked at the 3 things for a while. Then she closed the notebook. She picked up her phone. She did not call Harold Finch with a dissolution request. She called the estate office number and asked to speak with Edmund directly. The smooth professional voice paused for a moment, which was the first time that voice had ever paused, and then she was connected. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "I have found the 1987 amendment." He was quiet. She said, "I know what it means. I know that I can request a dissolution right now if I want to." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am not calling to request a dissolution." Another pause. Longer than his usual ones. She said, "I am calling because I have drafted a framework proposal for the trust outcome review, and I wanted to let you know before Harold circulated it, in case you had any initial thoughts." He said, after a moment, "You drafted the full framework?" She said, "Yes, 3 hours this afternoon. I can send it directly, if you would like to see it before it goes to Harold." He said, "I would like that." She said, "I will send it in the next 5 minutes." She sent it. He read it. He called her back in 20 minutes, and they talked about the framework for 40 minutes, during which he had 12 specific observations, 4 of which were the kind of precise, detailed commentary that immediately made the proposal better, and 3 of which raised questions she had not thought to ask herself, and she wrote all of it down and thought about how to incorporate it, and by the end of the call the framework had become something considerably stronger than what she had sent. She said, "The January review is in 3 weeks." He said, "The 25th. She said, "I will have a revised draft ready before then." He said, "Good." A pause, different from the professional pauses of the meeting table. She said, "Edmund." He said, "Yes." She said, "You should have told me about the permanence clause from the beginning." He said, "I know." She said, "And you should have told me what you were hoping for, rather than arranging conditions for me to discover it." He said, "Yes." She said, "When I come in January, I want us to have an honest conversation about all of it, not in the middle of a meeting, not through Harold, an actual conversation." He said, "I would like that." She said, "Good." She said good night. He said good night, Clara. She ended the call and sat in the quiet of her flat and noticed that the quiet felt different again, full rather than empty, expectant rather than absent. It was the same room, the same silence, and it had changed because she had moved towards something instead of staying still. She opened her notebook. She turned to the new page. Below the 3 things she had written, she added a 4th. It said, "See what happens when you stop waiting to be certain." She looked at it for a long time. Then she made herself a cup of tea, which she finished while it was still warm, which was rarer than it should have been, and went to bed earlier than usual and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The January review was 21 days away. She thought about it as she fell asleep, not with the careful, braced attention of someone managing a situation, but with the open, unguarded anticipation of someone who has decided to want something and stopped arguing with themselves about it. It was a better way to go to sleep. She was fairly sure it was a better way to live. She arrived at Harcliffe Manor on the Friday evening, before the January review, in the same way she had arrived every time before, by train, then taxi, down the long oak-lined gravel drive, with the house lit from inside against the dark. But it was different this time, and she knew it was different, and she did not try to tell herself otherwise. The difference was not external. The drive looked the same. The house looked the same. Margaret opened the door in the same calm, unhurried way, and told her that her room was ready, and that dinner would be at 7. The old terrier was in the kitchen, asleep on the same chair. The difference was that she was not bracing herself. Every previous visit she had walked into this house with some degree of internal armor in place, a posture of clarity, a managed awareness of what she was here to do, and what she was not going to let herself do. She had kept herself in the position of someone conducting an assessment, someone who had arrived for a purpose and would leave when the purpose was served. She was not doing that this time. She went upstairs, put her bag on the bed, looked out the window at the dark January garden. The frost was back, and the old stone wall at the far end of the lawn was pale in the moonlight. She stood at the window for a moment and let herself simply be in the room, without agenda, without the managed distance she had been keeping between herself and this place. It was easier than she expected. She went down for dinner. Edmund was in the kitchen when she came in, which was unusual. Harold typically arrived for dinner, and the 3 of them ate in the small dining room. He was standing at the counter going through a folder of papers that he appeared to have brought in from the study, and the old terrier had relocated from his chair to a position near Edmund's feet in the way dogs do when they have decided the most interesting person in the room has moved. Margaret was at the stove, doing something with a pot that smelled very good. Edmund looked up when she came in. He said, "Harold sends his apologies. He has a family matter this evening and will join us for the review in the morning." She said, "That is fine." She sat at the kitchen table. Margaret served the food without ceremony and then said she would leave them to it and went out. And the kitchen was warm and the terrier settled back down, and it was just the two of them and the sound of the frost forming on the windows. They talked about the framework proposal first, because that was the shape of their relationship, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He had 3 additional observations since their phone call. She had incorporated 2 of them already, and had a question about the third, and they went back and forth on it for a while, in the way she had come to find genuinely satisfying. Not agreement for its own sake, not deference, but 2 people who were each thinking clearly, and were not afraid to say when the other person had found something they had missed. She had missed something. He was right about it. She acknowledged this, made a note, and moved on. Then the conversation moved, naturally, and without her pushing it, away from the framework. He asked how she had found the 1987 amendment. She told him about Harriet, and the conference, and Professor Croft. He said, "I should have found it myself, or made sure Harold had found it." She said, "You should have." He said, "I was looking for the things that tied you here. I was not looking as carefully for the things that gave you a way out." She said, "I know." He said, "That is not a good reflection on me." She said, "No, it is not. But I am not sitting here because I have decided to ignore it. I am sitting here because I looked at the full picture and made a choice, and those are not the same thing." He said, "I understand the difference." She said, "I know you do." They were quiet for a moment. The old terrier made a small sound in his sleep. She said, "Tell me something about you that is not about the estate." He looked at her. She said, "We have been talking about the estate for 3 months. I know the tenant income adjustment formula. I know the 1947 amendment almost by heart. I know what your father left unfinished and what you did about it. I do not know very much about who you are when none of that is in the room." He was quiet, in the particular way he was quiet, when he was thinking, rather than withholding. He said, "I read a great deal. Not estate materials, fiction mostly, and natural history, which you know already." She said, "What kind of fiction?" He said, "Novels. Not recent ones, mostly. Older things. I like the ones where the plot is relatively simple, and the interest is entirely in the people." She said, "Because you find people interesting." He said, "Because I find people difficult to understand, which is not the same as finding them uninteresting. Novels give you access to the interior of another person in a way that ordinary life rarely does." She thought about this. She said, "Is that why you observe rather than ask?" He said, "Yes, probably. It is a habit I developed young, and have never fully found an alternative to." She said, "Asking is an alternative." He said, "Asking requires the other person to want to answer." She said, "Most people want to be asked things. It is one of the basic things people want." He said, "I did not know that, when I was young. I learned it late." She looked at him. He said this without self-pity, not in the way someone says I had a hard time to invite sympathy, but in the way someone states a fact they have examined and made peace with. She said, "What was it like, growing up here?" He said, "Large, and quiet, and full of obligation, in the way that very old things tend to be. My father was present, but not forthcoming. He showed me what to do more than he explained why to do it. I think he assumed that if I watched long enough I would understand." She said, "Did you?" He said, "Mostly. The things I did not understand took longer than they should have, because there was no one to ask." She said, "You should have asked." He said, "I know that now." She said, "You are making a habit of learning things late." He said, and she heard the faint, almost invisible shift in his voice, that she had come to recognize, as the closest thing to humor he routinely allowed himself. "I appear to be." She smiled. It was not a managed smile, not a professional smile, not a smile held in reserve. It was just a smile. He looked at it. He looked at her, and for the first time in 4 months of knowing this man, she saw something in his expression that was not a managed composure and not a careful directness, but simply, plainly, and without any effort to conceal it, relief. As if something he had been waiting for had arrived, and the waiting was over. She said, "I have been thinking about what I want to do." He said, "I know." She said, "Not with the estate, with my own situation, professionally." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have been thinking about the charitable foundation, the trust's work. The outcome framework is only the beginning. What the trust is doing is genuinely important, but structurally it is not fulfilling its potential. There is funding going to good projects without the kind of strategic direction that would make the impact significantly larger. Someone who understood both the operational side and the legal and financial framework could make a real difference to how it is run." He said nothing. He was watching her. She said, "I am not asking for a job." He said, "I know you are not." She said, "I am telling you that I have been thinking about what kind of work would actually use what I am capable of, and that the work that I have been doing here, in the context of the estate and the foundation, is considerably more interesting and more valuable than anything I was doing before." He said, "Yes, I can see that." She said, "So I would like to understand what the formal structure would look like, if there were a professional role here, that was not defined by the charter but by actual terms I had negotiated myself." He said, "I would like that conversation." She said, "Not tonight." He said, "Not tonight." She said, "Tonight, I just want to eat the food Margaret made and drink the tea and sit here." He said, "That is acceptable to me." So they did that. They sat in the warm kitchen and finished the food and talked about things that had nothing to do with the estate, about the natural history books, about the fiction he read, and the things she had read and not finished, and the things she meant to read and probably would not, about the way London felt different in January than in any other month, about the county he had grown up in, and the parts of it that were genuinely beautiful if you knew where to look. They talked the way people talk when they have been circling something for a long time, and have finally stopped circling and are standing in the middle of it. At some point, Margaret looked in to say goodnight, and was clearly not surprised to find them still at the kitchen table. At some point, the terrier woke up, stretched with tremendous dedication, and walked to the door of the kitchen, which Edmund opened for him, and the dog went out into the dark corridor, and they listened to the sound of his paws on the flagstones, going toward wherever he slept. They were quiet for a while after that. She said, "You said, in December, that you intended to have the conversation with me before April. About the permanence clause." He said, "Yes." She said, "What would you have said?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was going to answer honestly, and was choosing the exact form of the answer carefully. He said, "I would have told you everything I told you in December, minus the anger. I would have told you about the 1947 amendment, and what it meant, and when the permanence clause would activate. And I would have told you that if you wanted to leave before it activated, I would process the dissolution without objection. And I would have told you that if you wanted to stay, you were welcome to, not as a charter obligation, but because I thought this place was better with you in it than without you." She said, "You could have said that in October." He said, "I was not sure of it in October." She said, "When were you sure of it?" He said, "November. When you asked about the agricultural cost index, and Harold did not know the answer." She looked at him. He said, "It was the first time I had seen someone engage with the estate as a thing worth thinking hard about, rather than a thing to observe politely. It was the first time in 8 years I had been in one of those meetings and thought, this is how it should work." She said, "And then you did not tell me." He said, "And then I did not tell you, which I have acknowledged and which I will not excuse further." She said, "Good. One acknowledgement is enough." He said, "Yes." She said, "So, going forward." He said, "Yes." She said, "Full disclosure, from both sides, at all times, on anything relevant to the situation between us." He said, "Agreed." She said, "And when things are complicated, we say so, rather than managing around them." He said, "Agreed. I am considerably better at that in writing than in speech. She said, I noticed. Your letters are more honest than your sentences. He said, I have more time to think in letters. She said, then write me letters when you need to think. I will write back. He said, I would like that. She stood up from the kitchen table. She said good night. She said she would see him at 9 for the review. He stood too. He said good night, Clara. She was at the door of the kitchen when he said her name. She turned. He said, I am glad you did not send the dissolution request. She looked at him. He was standing in the warm kitchen light, with the empty table behind him and the dark windows beyond it, and he looked, for the first time in 4 months, like a person who was not holding anything back. She said, so am I. She went upstairs. She stood at her window and looked at the frost on the garden and the pale stone wall and the cold January sky above the property that she had arrived at by accident and chosen to stay in on purpose, and she felt the particular quality of a moment that is not yet anything fully defined, but has become something real, something that has its own shape and its own weight and its own forward direction. She was not certain. She had stopped waiting to be certain. She went to bed. In the morning, the review began at 9, and Harold was there with his reading glasses on his forehead and his folders arranged in the order she had come to recognize as his standard practice, and the cross-referenced agricultural data was on the table. And the revised trust framework was the first agenda item, and Edmund came in with 2 cups of coffee and put one at her place without comment, and the January light came through the estate room windows at the low angle of winter, and Clara opened her folder and looked at the first item on the agenda, and she was ready. 1 year is a long time, and also not a long time, depending on what happens inside it. If you had asked Clara Voss, on the rainy Monday morning when she handed the Harcliffe courier packet to the driver at 9:28, whether she expected to spend the following year learning the difference between heritage planning consent and listed building consent, managing the investment portfolio of a charitable foundation, negotiating tenant farm agreements with families whose grandparents had negotiated with an earlier version of the same estate, and arguing with a duke about whether 3 additional grant categories would strengthen or dilute the trust's focus, she would have looked at you with the expression of someone who has been asked a genuinely ridiculous question. She would have been wrong. The January review had been the beginning of a different chapter, though she would not have used that word at the time, because it was the kind of word that sounded larger than the reality warranted. What it was, more precisely, was the beginning of a working arrangement that had been negotiated between 2 people who had both made mistakes in how they handled the situation, had acknowledged those mistakes without excessive drama, and had decided to move forward with a clearer understanding of what they were doing and why. The negotiation of her formal role at the estate took 2 months and 3 separate conversations, one of which was conducted almost entirely in writing because Edmund was better at it in letters, and she had meant it when she said she would write back. They went back and forth on the terms with the kind of focused, detailed attention that both of them brought to contracts of any kind, and when they arrived at something they were both satisfied with, they sat across from Harold Finch and signed it. Not an Ashford Charter document. A proper employment contract, current format, governed by standard employment law, with a salary she had negotiated herself, and a notice period, and a defined scope of responsibilities, and an explicit provision that the role was hers, independently of any other arrangement between the parties, meaning, it did not depend on the charter agreement, and would not be affected by whatever became of the charter agreement. Harold Finch had been quietly, but visibly pleased throughout the entire negotiation. He said, when the final contract was signed, that he was glad the situation had resolved satisfactorily. He said this in the tone of a man who had been hoping for a particular outcome for some time, and was relieved that it had arrived. Clara said, "Did you know, from the beginning, that Edmund intended to keep the agreement rather than dissolve it?" Harold said, "I suspected his reasons for not dissolving it were not entirely procedural." She said, "You could have told me about the permanence clause yourself." Harold said, "I should have done that, yes, and I apologize for not doing so. I am afraid I fell into the habit of allowing the Duke to manage the information he wished to manage, which was not the right approach when the other party had not been fully informed." She said, "Thank you for that." Harold said, "You are a significant improvement on the previous co-custodian arrangements," she said. How many previous ones were there? Harold said, in the estate's history, 6. None of them involved quite as much difficulty at the beginning. She said, or quite as much cross-referencing of agricultural data. Harold said, with the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on his face, decidedly not. The custodial agreement, which had started all of this, was formally dissolved in April, on the first Monday of the month, exactly 6 months from the date of registration, by mutual consent. Edmund signed the dissolution document at the estate room table, and Clara signed it beside him, and Harold filed it with the registry, and that was that. It was, in one sense, the end of the arrangement that had begun with the misplaced signature card on a rushed Monday morning in October. In the sense that mattered, it was not an ending at all. The Ashford Community Trust had its first standardized outcome review in March, using the framework Clara had developed, revised, and refined over the winter months. The results were more useful than anyone had expected, not because the Trust's funded projects had been unsuccessful, but because the review made visible, for the first time, patterns in what kinds of projects produced the strongest outcomes over time, and what kinds stalled, despite good intentions and adequate funding. The Foundation Committee used the data to restructure its grant categories for the following year. Clara ran the review process herself and presented the findings at the Foundation's spring meeting. Edmund sat at the back of the room during the presentation and said nothing until the questions section, at which point he asked one question, and it was the best question in the room, and she answered it directly, and the committee approved the restructured grant categories unanimously. Afterwards, in the car back to the manor, he said, "Well done." She said, "The framework was good." He said, "The framework was good, because you understood what the trust needed, not just what the process required. Those are different skills." She said, "I know." He said nothing more about it. He did not need to. She had learned, over the winter, that he was not a person who expanded on compliments, because he believed a compliment said once, precisely, was worth more than one said twice with elaboration. She had come to agree with this. The secondary building's heritage assessment took 4 months from start to submission. Clara managed the documentation process from the beginning, organizing the survey work, commissioning the structural assessments, drafting the supporting historical notes from Edmund's own detailed knowledge of each building, and coordinating with the heritage body through a process that was longer and more involved than anyone had anticipated. The listing was granted in June. When the notification arrived, she found Edmund in the study with the letter in his hand, reading it with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. He said, "The cottage is listed." She said, "And the barn?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Your father would be glad." He looked at her. He said, "Yes, he would." They stood in the study for a moment. The June light through the windows was the opposite of the December light, high and full, and without the winter's careful economy. Outside, the garden was in the extravagant state of early summer, everything growing faster than it could be managed and not caring about being managed. He said, "I want to show you something." He took her to the north end of the estate grounds, to the now-listed cottage with its repointed south wall and its new window frames that had been fitted in the early spring from timber sourced from the estate's own woodland, as the original frames had been. They stood in front of it in the summer light. She said, "It looks right." He said, "It looks like itself." She said, "Is there a difference?" He said, "Things look right when they match an idea of what they should be. They look like themselves when they have become what they were going to be all along." She thought about that. She said, "Is that how you see the estate? As something becoming what it was always going to be?" He said, "I see it as something that has a direction. Not a destination, a direction. Every generation adds something, and removes something, and tries to ensure that what they add is truer than what they remove." She said, "And what are you adding?" He said, without looking away from the cottage, "I am still working that out." She looked at him. He was standing in the same way he had been standing the first time she had walked through these grounds with him, easy, not performing, simply present in the place he knew best. She had been thinking about something for several weeks. She had not found the right moment to say it, not because she was uncertain about it, but because the right moment was a specific thing, and she had learned, from him and from herself over the past year, that specific things were worth being specific about. She said, "I want to expand the Foundation's work into agricultural education." He turned and looked at her. She said, "There are 3 communities in the county within 20 miles of the estate, where the farming knowledge has been declining for 2 generations. No one is teaching it. The schools do not have the resources, and the agricultural colleges are too far and too expensive. The trust has the capacity to fund a practical training program, and the estate has the land to run it on, and the tenant farmers have the knowledge to teach it. It would take real investment and serious planning, and it would take 2 years to show results." He said, "Tell me more." She told him more. For the next 40 minutes, they walked the boundary of the North Fields, and she outlined the idea in the details she had been developing privately. The budget framework, the partner organizations she had already made informal contact with, the curriculum structure she had sketched out, the way the program could be housed on the estate grounds without interfering with the current operations. He listened the way he listened to everything, entirely, without interruption, with the occasional question that came precisely at the point where she was about to address the thing the question was asking about. When she finished, they were standing at the old stone boundary wall at the far north edge of the estate. He said, "This is what you are adding." She understood what he meant. She said, "If it works." He said, "It will work." She said, "You cannot know that." He said, "I know the person who designed it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The summer light was on the stone wall, and the fields beyond it, and the old oak trees at the far edge of the grounds. And somewhere nearby, a skylark was doing what skylarks do in June, climbing and falling, and filling the warm air with sound. She said, "I want to talk about the contract." He said, "Which one?" She said, "The employment one. I want to renegotiate the scope." He said, "What do you want to add?" She said, "I want the foundation directorship formally included. Not as a secondary responsibility, as a primary one. I want my own budget authority over the trust. I want to be named in the grant communications, rather than listed as an estate representative." He said, "I will have Harold amend the contract." She said, "I want to see the draft before it goes to Harold." He said, "Always." She said, "And I want one more thing." He said, "Yes?" She said, "I want us to be clearer about what this is." He was very still. She said, "Not in a legal sense, not in a charter sense. I am done with legal instruments as a way of defining things between people. I want us to be clear the way people are clear when they have decided to be honest with each other." She said, "I know. You have been better at it since December. I want to keep being better at it, both of us, and I want to do that with a shared understanding of what we are building." He said, quietly, "What do you think we are building?" She said, "I think we are building something that has a direction, not a destination. I think we are both adding something, and I think what we are adding is truer than what we started with. And I think that is worth saying out loud, between us, without a charter involved." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Yes, it is worth saying." She said, "So say it." He said, "This, what is between us, is the thing I value most about this year. More than the foundation review. More than the heritage listing. More than the agricultural data framework. What I have found, in having you here, is something I did not know I was missing, and I do not want to go back to the version of this estate that existed before you walked down that gravel drive." She said nothing for a moment. She said, "For a man who is better in writing, that was not bad." He said, "I have been composing it for several weeks." She laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, and he looked at her with the expression she had first seen in December. Not quite relief anymore, because there was nothing to be relieved about, and not quite a smile, because he was not a person who smiled easily, but something warmer than either of those things. She said, "Then we understand each other." He said, "We understand each other." The first Monday of October came around again, 1 full year after the original custodial agreement had been lodged in the Harcliffe Estate Registry, with a signature that had not been meant to be there. Clara was in the estate room, going through the materials for the quarterly review, when the thought arrived. 1 year ago she had been 12 minutes late, and wet-coated and rushing, and she had put a signature in the wrong packet, and it had pulled the thread of her life in a direction she had not chosen and could not have predicted. She thought about the version of herself who had sat in the sitting room of this house and asked, with perfect composure, "And what does that mean for me?" She thought about the version of herself who had walked back down the gravel drive without looking back. She thought about the list with, "What is he not saying?" at the bottom. She thought about Nell saying, "You are making it complicated because you are afraid." She thought about her own answer, "Stop treating clarity as something that comes before the decision." Harold Finch came in with his coffee and his folders and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He said good morning and put his folders in order and sat down. He looked at her and said that she looked well. She said, "I am well." He said, "The foundation report is strong this quarter." She said, "Yes. The agricultural education pilot had a better first intake than I projected." He said, "The Duke is pleased." She said, "I know. He told me." Harold said, "Yes, I imagine he did." She could not tell whether Harold's expression at that moment was the expression of a man who was simply making a professional observation, or a man who had been watching a situation unfold for a year and felt entitled to a small measure of quiet satisfaction. She suspected it was both. Edmund came in. He put a coffee at her place. He sat down and opened his folder and said, "Shall we begin?" She said, "Let us begin." The morning light was on the estate room windows. The frost from the night before was still on the garden, but would be gone by mid-morning. The quarterly review materials were the most comprehensive they had been since she started, because she had expanded what was tracked and how it was tracked, and the picture they painted of the Harcliffe estate was clearer and stronger than it had been a year ago. She thought, briefly and without sentimentality, about Geoffrey Crane telling her she was suspended, and watching her leave Hargreaves and Sutton with her coat and her plant. She thought about standing on the pavement in the rain and thinking about finding a lawyer and fixing this quickly. She was glad she had not fixed it quickly. She was glad the signature had landed in the wrong packet on a rushed Monday morning, which was not something she would have said in October or November or December, and which she would have said with increasing conviction from January onward, and which she said now with a completeness that had nothing provisional or managed about it. She opened her folder. She began.